if you're humbled before God, you are going to fall short. Just remember that. And you aren't going to be perfect for everyone. And not that that's the excuse, but are you going to fret over that? Or are you going to rest in what the Lord's teaching you and growing you and being strong where you're weak? And so this might be like Christianity 101, but I think it's the one we can keep learning over and over.
Welcome to the Extraordinary Lives podcast, where we talk about lives that go beyond the ordinary to the extraordinary, with the extra being Jesus. We'll be encouraged with amazing stories and helpful insights from the lives of ordinary people who have that extra, that supernatural difference that only Jesus can give. I'm your host, Ellen Bennett. Thanks for joining us. Hi, everyone. I am so excited to welcome Ryan and Sara Rosenbaum to the show. Ryan is the lead pastor at Seacoast Community Church in Encinitas. And Sara, his wife, is very involved with the Community Resource Center in Encinitas. So we'll be hearing a little bit about that. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Glad to be here with you, and I'm excited to talk to your listeners. This is fun.
Great. I'm excited to hear your stories.
You know, in my current job as lead pastor, I get to teach.
You get to share God stories every week.
That's right.
I get to see them, too, in different ways. Yeah, I think there's so many little stories along the way. I'd say one big one in our marriage that Sara didn't share, but her sisters and her mom are following Jesus now and strong in their faith. And that wasn't the case when we got married. And, you know, you look at that and what seemed like a difference in the two families, you know, God's really worked in a lot of ways there. And that's huge.
Yeah, that's huge.
That's a big part of it. And somewhat connected too. You know, it's interesting, our two families were so different, but some of our heart developed the same, which is one thing we have in common is for the marginalized. Part of it, I think both of my families were farmers and communal and very generous and sacrificial, the way of life. And part of it is out of necessity. You just take care of each other. But that was modeled on both sides of my family to always care for others around you. And both sets of my grandparents never had money, but they were the most generous people you'd ever meet and would care if someone, you know, I think the first time I took Sara to Minnesota and we'd drop in on family for the first time for her, they would have the full spread of food, you know, that Midwest style, but also the hugs and welcome in your family. But it would be the same for neighbors if someone needed something. And also you see that in the military community often is if someone is deployed, the other people who are not deployed will take care of whatever comes up. So that was kind of embedded in me even before being a Christian and once I became a Christian. So I think a lot of, you know, my heart, I did a lot through youth ministry with missions, serving, just trying to get students to learn these same things of look how God will show up when we put ourselves aside.
That's great.
So now I get to teach most weeks and talk. And one of the things that strikes me is how many times, and I can't share everyone's story, you know, they're their stories, but how many people will come up to me and say, you don't understand where I was at before this morning.
Wow.
Or, you know, people will say, I haven't been to church in 3 years, and I came today needing one thing. And for some reason, you said what I needed God to say today. And I would say at least once a month, that's a story where even recently I had one as early as this week. Actually, there's a family who said we were about to give up on church altogether. We're new to the area and we just have been so disillusioned. But we found the community here at this church, how they treated us, welcoming us in, and then how you as a church are trying to walk the line of just loving the community, but not being of the world, but in the world. And they said, we were about to no longer be churchgoers.
Wow.
But we're here and God's used this community to really save our family.
Wow.
And when I hear those things, to me, I'm always, well, that's not what I meant for you to hear.
Right.
I had a much better point. And so it's a reminder almost every week of how God will use what I can offer. As pastors, most of us would probably relate to, there's a times you get off stage and go, that was my best sermon ever. Yes. And it's crickets. No one will say anything.
Right. Totally.
And then some weeks you'll come off and go like, oh, I don't even think that made sense to me. You'll get a line of people who say,
yes.
You know, and I think those are reminders of how God's saying, I'll be the one who will change hearts and lives.
That's great.
And you be faithful to prepare and to do what I've asked you to do. And then let me do the work of changing hearts. And that's been a 20-year thing to learn, but it's really freeing because it takes the burden even off me to try to be God in someone's life and just
really
be faithful. So I get to see that. We had one other story. It's kind of fun. Is about a month and a half ago, there was someone in our parking lot who is living in his car, and he used our bathroom at the church and saw that we were advertising baptisms. And so he went to our front office and saw our office administrator, Patricia, and went in there and said, "Hey, I want to be baptized." And so he got up to my office that day, and we started a conversation. And he said, "Yeah, I follow the zodiac, and the stars have led me here
Wow.
to be baptized."
Yes.
And I said, "Okay." Where do we start with that? You know? So I said, well, I do believe the creator of the stars might have used those to get your attention. And we sat there for a couple hours and walked through the beginning of Scripture and talked about the story of just the whole Bible, which was interesting. So he was very interested, 25 years old, had a lot of questions, and kept saying, this makes sense. I think God's doing something. And we got to the story of Jesus, and he said, "Oh, I know about Jesus. I've watched some episodes of The Chosen."
Yes.
Which I was like, okay, cool. Then you know the story. Well, and he was really frustrated. This shows you where he came from with no knowledge of Scripture. He was really frustrated that the Romans crucified Jesus. And it's like, I'm just so mad at them. And we talked about, well, this was prophesied, so we talked some prophecy. But then I said, well, but there's good news, right? You know what happens next? And he didn't.
Wow.
He didn't know about the resurrection. And I said, Jesus rose from the dead. And he said, he literally looked at me and goes, that must be next season.
Oh, I love that. Wow.
But he was so overjoyed.
Yes.
He said, oh, he's okay.
Wow.
And so we put that aside and got back the next week and just kept talking a little more and got to a point, do you want to follow Jesus? And he said, yes, I do. And we prayed together and we baptized him that day just 2 months ago. But here's a guy who was living in his car, working a couple jobs, working really hard, just through just some circumstances, ended up on the street, but a hard worker, good kid, and joined Rooted. Recently, he's moved north because doesn't have a home, but he's getting towards there. But it was just one of those stories where God just used this. And I was inconvenienced that afternoon when I heard he was there. I'm like, oh,
right.
I need to have this conversation right now.
Yeah. And it's usually not at a convenient time.
It isn't, no. And I remember, I think we actually had our sermon teaching team waiting. They were coming in about an hour, and I just said, fine, I'll squeeze them in. But those are the things where God's like, just be available and let me figure this out.
Yeah.
And it's a really neat story. We're still in touch of seeing him kind of grow in his new faith. Those things remind you of why we do what we do.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's really good. So one other thing that I know about you all is just your involvement in the community. So I know you've really enjoyed coaching Little League and also playing on basketball teams.
Yes. So I get my aggression out. Yes.
Yes. So it seems like from the outside looking in, you wanting to live out Jesus in your everyday life. So tell me a little bit about that. What is your philosophy on that, or why do you get involved in the community?
It is intentional. As someone working in the church, our whole life can become about the church and people in it, and a lot of our time is spent here. But we also know the majority of people who we're called to pastor and lead are working in maybe a marketplace, non-Christian environments. And so you have to have a little bit of perspective. If all my interactions are with Christians, you can lose touch.
Right.
That's on one side. The other side is we do feel like Jesus has called us to go and make disciples. And you can't do that without meeting people who don't know him. And so it's just really that intentionality of living out our faith in everyday life and do it through the things you enjoy. That's really important. That what are your passions?
Yeah.
And fortunately, we have a leadership team, our elder board at the church, who actually years ago encouraged me to stay involved in the community, which I appreciate.
That's good.
And so it's been fun to be able to coach baseball. Last year I coached a team. I didn't have a kid on the team.
Wow, that's great.
So they needed someone to coach, and so I did. And, I've performed weddings of families who had kids on my team. I've had a lot of those families visit, and they know what I stand for and what I do as a job. And so it's a great opportunity to kind of represent Christ and also do something I love to do.
Yeah.
I love working with students still and coaching, and so it fulfills that desire. I'm performing a wedding of someone who I play basketball with this weekend. Yeah, so I think those are the doors God opens up when you're present and out there, and And it is a little weird because I consider it part of my job, but it's not the tangible what you might see if you're just part of Seacoast. So
that's
but
great.
Yeah.
Hey, I just have to throw in there, I got married on a basketball court.
Oh, nice.
Really?
So I kept looking for other churches, but the church we were going to at the time met in a multi-purpose room.
Right.
The carpet was a basketball court with 2 basketball goals that they could, lift up and put away. So I remember thinking, okay, I'm walking down the middle of the basketball key here to get married. But
yeah, that's good. Oh, that's good.
I love how getting married 20 years or more ago, you were probably in a church. There's probably some smelly carpet involved.
Yes.
Probably just cake and deviled eggs, I mean, we thought we were so cool doing deviled eggs, actually. It's like, oh, wow, we're having a full-on...
We're at the officers club.
Oh, yeah. It wasn't just in the basement. So.
Nice.
And now I would love to go back and get some Instagram-worthy photos, that don't include a sheet hanging behind us.
That's great.
So, yeah.
I do have to admit, being from Tennessee, I did have a bluegrass band.
Oh,
and
nice.
barbecue.
Oh, there you go.
So fun. All right. Well, anything else you want to share? And then I'd love to ask you about anything God's teaching you now that you would love to share.
So one God story that does come to mind is the story of my grandparents and my grandfather in particular. I didn't grow up in a Christian home for most of my life, but my grandparents were believers. And when my grandfather passed away, it was actually pretty sudden. It was very traumatic for our family, but my grandma pulled out his Bible when we were kind of gathering together and found in the back of it a list of his prayer requests. And she shared with us that every single morning my grandpa would pull this list out and pray fervently over each name and each item on the list. And each of me and my 9 sisters' cousins were on that list. And she said he had done that his entire life. And it really spoke to me and my heart just that I had had somebody praying for me my entire life. And I literally went home that day and wrote a list to tuck inside my own Bible. And since that time, it's been now almost 20 years, but I have that same list where I pray over my children and my family members and certain people who I just wanted to give that same blessing to.
I love that.
Yeah. So.
And was that on your mom or dad's side?
It was my mom's dad.
You mentioned your mom. Mm-hmm. Did you see your dad growing up much after the divorce?
I saw him every other weekend. My dad was a hard worker and a provider for us, but my mom primarily raised us, with the exception of there was a season when she was in the hospital for an extended amount of time, and he raised us during that time, but he worked swing shift. So our vision of our dad was he was asleep when we woke up, and there'd be lunch money on the counter, and then when we'd come home from school, he'd be at work already. He worked for Boeing, and then he also, for a while, worked for a boating company as a welder. There's a season when we didn't have any money, and he welded shopping carts.
Wow.
Yeah. So I do have to say that, when you ask how God makes a difference, mm-hmm. Twice we had to leave Mission Viejo. And twice it was heartbreaking for us. The first time we left, we went to Israel. And the second time we left, we came to Encinitas. And I remember thinking about the verse that says that God is close to the brokenhearted, to those who are crushed in spirit, and really clinging to that truth that God is with us when things feel unstable. I can be a control freak. I can be an overthinker. And so going to a new place can be overwhelming. And I remember in both of those instances, in both our marriage and in my walk with the Lord, just, again, the fact that he was present in those times of transition really made all the difference. I remember living in Israel and feeling, again, really alone similar to being a kid. You're just sort of that outsider looking in. Except for in those moments, I really didn't feel alone. It was sort of like, I'm here, I'm looking out at all of you, but the Lord is right there with me. Mm-hmm. And I used to joke that the spiritual masochism, which is in great pain, you experience God's love and comfort in a way that you don't experience him on the mountaintop experience. Right. And so those are kind of more general God moments, I guess, but just how I know what it's like to feel lost and alone and feel like the burden is on your own shoulders. And I know what it's like to go through a hard season walking with the Lord, and they're just not the same. Mm-hmm. And I do have to say that being raised primarily in a non-Christian home is one of the things, to be honest, I'm grateful for. Because, you know, when Ryan said, why do we want to be out in the community? The big thing for me is that I was this non-Christian punk kid, granted straight A kid, granted athlete kid.
Not the same kind of punk kid I was.
No, but very cynical, very, you know, jaded towards the world. And Christians who were willing to be in my world, to be part of my life, who weren't only at church, but were in public education or were someone's grandparent or, you know, were a friend's mom or dad, really impacted my life. I mean, yes, God ultimately drew me to him, but each of those people played such a huge role in who I am today. Mm-hmm. And most of them I can't even find today to let them know, but I can try to be that person for someone else. That's and great. I can believe that if I'm giving a taco to my kid's friend, that might be the moment of kindness or compassion where they see Jesus at work and in our family. And so I think, again, those big God moments that we've experienced, then, you know, we can kind of be excited to be a part of the story moving forward.
That's great. I like that. Yeah, good.
Yeah.
What are some things that you would love for the listeners to know about God, or things that you're learning that you'd love to impart?
Well, I think the most fresh is just, you know, we've been going through the book of James as a church, which is just this great book of wisdom. There's all these little sayings. And then we gave the challenge to the church about a week or two ago to also read one proverb a day. Again, you can just pick up so many little life lessons, reminders of how you use your words, or just all those. So those have been good. But for me, I think if you look at just kind of the core of almost all of the wisdom is just, again, your position before God. You know, what does it mean to humble yourself? With every Christian, we know that answer. But I think when seasons of life come and go, hard seasons, easy seasons, I think of even just coming out of COVID for 2.5 years of what it did to just society, just the division. For me, it goes back to what does it mean to really humble yourself before God? And to me, it comes to what does he provide for me when it comes to my security? What does he provide for me when it comes to my identity, regardless of what someone else is thinking or feeling or saying, and or what I feel where I'm falling short? As those reminders like, wait, if you're humbled before God, you are going to fall short. Just remember that. And you aren't going to be perfect for everyone. And not that that's the excuse, but are you going to fret over that? Or are you going to rest in what the Lord's teaching you and growing you and being strong where you're weak? And so this might be like Christianity 101, but I think it's the one we can keep learning over and over.
Definitely.
And I think the book of James has just been that reminder too. And even if you look at the source of all the conflicts, it's when we get pretty big view of ourselves.
Yes, that's really good. I like the word fret that you used. I can relate to fretting over those kinds of things. And I'm just reminded of the verse in Micah, which is, he has shown you what is good
what
and
the Lord requires
what
of
the Lord
thee or you.
Yes, but to love mercy, act justly, and walk humbly with your God. And that humility is so important. There's a verse also that I love in Ephesians 4 that is, be completely humble, gentle, be patient with each other, bearing with one another in love. But it's that completely humble that gets me. If it just said humble, I'd be like, okay, but completely humble, oh no.
Right.
So I think it's so true, having that ability to get out of ourselves and think about others as well, and just can be a very healthy way to interact with others, but just also before God. My last podcast, we were laughing at the fact that we could have pride before this amazing God. I mean, who are we?
Right, yeah. Walking humbly with him takes the burden off of ourselves from trying to perform or get results from other people. And it puts the burden on God where it belongs.
That's a great point.
And so it's actually really freeing. And I think when you're leading a church or leading a family or even in a marriage, when you are able to, and again, it doesn't become an excuse like, it's God's problem, not mine, so I'll be lazy. But it's, this is God's problem, so I'll let him, I will live before him and do all I can as up to the Lord. And when I fall short, I fall on his grace. And if I succeed, it's by his grace. But ultimately, it's just so freeing, actually, when you let God play his role.
That's great. So. That was very helpful for me, for sure.
It is freeing, but humility can also be very painful. And it can stretch muscles that don't always want to be stretched.
Yes.
So I would say what God is teaching me right now is I'm married to a pastor in the 2020s. And I think Ryan mentioned on Sunday that it's almost getting to be old news to bring up COVID and this last season, but just with, so much trauma out there and all the uncertainty and all the division and all the pain that people are individually going through, and then how collectively as a society it's affected people. And pastors have been beat up a little bit, both spiritually, with words, with just trying to carry the health of a church. And something happened, I think it was a month ago, where I was probably being a troublemaker and asking Ryan some questions, and he sort of broke down. And I haven't seen that from him very many times in our marriage. And I remember just feeling heartbroken and realizing the magnitude of the pressure he was under. But old Sara would have in that moment maybe been kind of sad, but then been thinking about why I deserved him to respond differently to me. Well, my question wasn't that bad. Well, I've gone through COVID too. I need you to be here for me. But I just remember getting on my knees and praying for him and sort of feeling this peace of God and this call and reminder that in our marriage right now, the season might be that I go the distance. And again, he's an amazing man and does the dishes and does great things.
Yes.
But in that moment, it was, Sara, I want you to be the one to bend and to give more. That's so counterintuitive for me as a human, to be thinking, well, how are my needs being met? Even how did he see me in that moment, because I did kind of mess up. And normally I would be upset or defensive or even feel shame in that.
Sure.
But instead it was, okay, I messed up. And now I can be gracious to him and I can give a little bit more right now. And it ended up being a really sweet moment between me and the Lord, I think, of just sort of him working in my heart. But 25 years of marriage, I mean, you're going to have times where you don't do that well.
Right.
where you do respond very selfishly.
Yes.
But that, for me, marriage advice, other than having a good sense of humor and having a shared faith, it really is that concept of humility. So what Ryan said really is probably the same for me as well. But not only in marriage, but how are people going to respond to this podcast? How do people respond to my social media posts? How do my kids respond? Will they have to go to counseling and share, how I messed them up?
Yes.
But just walking this life that's a little messy and trusting it in God's hands. So
that's good.
Yeah.
Very good. Yeah, I have a friend who you all know, Lori, who says two things. One is, of course I just messed up instead of I can't believe I messed up. And that's so helpful to me.
Yeah.
And then the other thing she says is that she just knows, of course, she's going to have to pay for counseling for her kids, right? I mean, we all will, because we're not these perfect parents.
Right.
We don't know what we're doing.
Right.
So that's great.
That's great.
Well, we will finish up here. One more thing that I just realized was Haley had a COVID wedding. She had a wedding during COVID. And that was one of the most stressful times for me. It was just about a month when we were having to really decide, okay, what are we going to do? This place hasn't opened up. How many people can we have? How can we have people responsibly at the wedding with all of this going on? And I was just thinking how, for me, that was like a month of just intense stress. For some people it wouldn't have been that stressful, but for me, being really about people and their not only their perceptions but also wanting to protect people as well. It was just a stressful time. So I'm thinking, here I was going through that for a month. You were going through it for how many months? And you were in charge of a lot more people and a whole organization here. So thank you, Ryan.
Yeah, well, fortunately we had a good united team as far as the elder board and staff just praying about decisions, and it gave me more grace actually towards our governor and all the political leaders.
Yes.
Because although I don't always agree with a lot of the politics that represent our state,
Right.
You just realize you're in a lose-lose.
That's right.
You can't make a lot of decisions where people are. And I remember reaching out to our mayor and just telling her, "Hey, I'm praying for you. I know," and she was just kind of like, "Oh my goodness," And we don't always see the same views of the world.
Yes.
But just that burden is huge.
Yeah.
Always.
Well, on behalf of Seacoast, I just want to say thank you.
Oh, yeah.
And thank you, Sara, for being a big support as well.
Sure.
Well, thank you for doing this and for all the work you do in the community and part of Seacoast, too. It's so fun to know that you and Steve have been involved for how long at Seacoast?
Oh, my goodness. For, 28 years plus.
Yeah.
Because I was actually here as a single.
Oh, that's right. You brought him over.
Yes. And then once we were married, I was pregnant with Haley, who's now 27 when we came over. So, yeah.
Nice.
Yeah. Well, thank you guys so much. It's been such a pleasure and so fun to hear your stories. Thanks for sharing.
It's our pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone, for joining us. This is Ellen Bennett with the Extraordinary Lives podcast.